Stands down, maybe. But anyway, I'm John Conley. I'm employed by the Central London Community Healthcare NHS Trust, and I lead the Homeless Health Counselling Service, which specialises in homeless health. I've worked as a psychologist. I worked as a psychotherapist in a trauma stress clinic, and I took up my post about 6 years ago. And what I want to share with you today is how, when I first took up my post, I was completely and utterly baffled by what I was encountering in the counselling service. Very low morale amongst the counsellors and staff, and there was a real sense of we just don't know how to help the people who are coming to ask for our help. So I had a choice of either running away in despair, but obviously I didn't. And it came to me very, very gradually that the people I was lucky enough to be able to engage revealed invariably histories of early childhood abuse, which then led me on to realise that there was a very high level, it seemed, amongst the population using the counselling service, at least, of personality disorder, or what I like to call people suffering from a traumatised personality. People, it seemed, were in an almost constant state of trauma reaction. Very high physiological arousal symptoms, very short attention spans, very limited ability to take in new information, very anxiety-provoking to engage in a conversation or a relationship of more than a few minutes. So all these symptoms began for me to coalesce in this phenomenon of a traumatised personality. And I then realised that my behaviour and the behaviour of staff could either help calm and what we call contain somebody, calm someone, or actually trigger them off in an even more intense trauma reaction. And that's when I became fundamentally aware we have very little control over the conditions in which we work. We're politicians, we're policymakers, we're cutbacks. But maybe what we can control is that point of interaction with the person in front of us. And maybe we can't control them, but we can control ourselves. And we can control our body language, our attitudes, and our communication. So I began banging my drum with Westminster City Council and NHS trusts and saying, hey guys, I think there's a lot of personality disorder around. So I was sent, I was paid to go to do a personality disorder training. And this is where I had a great honour and a great privilege of meeting Paul. I was lost, I couldn't find the seminar room, and there was Paul, who seemed to know where he was going. So I asked him for directions, and Paul introduced himself. But just to say that Paul and I met, I think, probably around 6 years ago.
Yeah, about 6 years ago now.
And Paul's been enabling me to develop my practice and also to develop a model of intervention for the counselling service based on Paul's experiences and Paul's insights. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, so as John said, I met John on the CUF training. The CUF training is, I forgot what it's called now. Knowledge and Understanding Framework, which doesn't tell you a damn thing. But basically it's about raising awareness of personality disorder amongst frontline staff, basically. I've been doing that now for about the same time, around about 6 years roughly. And I now do it as my business. I do it as a living sort of thing. And I really enjoy it, and it's a great thing. So it's not just the monetary side of things. You know, I get so much back from it, and I learn so much about myself as well, and my abilities. Well, I was homeless for 20 years. I lived on the streets. I'm an alcoholic, a recovering alcoholic, I'm glad to say. Nearly 4 years sober. And through my experiences of homelessness and living on the street, inevitably got locked up in prison a few times, and this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. And for many years, I had no idea or understanding of why I was the way I was. And then I got sectioned, and I went to hospital, and blah, 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 blah. And then, like I say, I went onto this training thing to become a trainer in delivering the cuff training. And like I say, that's when I met John. And when I was telling John about my story, a bit about myself, I was surprised to find that actually my experiences, which I'd never really, I just wanted to forget my past. Do you know what I mean? Just put it behind me and forget about it. And over the years, with John and other people like John, I've learned that my experiences are actually really valuable and worth something, and actually, hopefully, can help other people. So that's basically, yeah, where am I?
Great. So the talk today is going to be about how I realised there was a need for me as a practitioner to go that extra mile, but also I discovered on the way the risks that it posed of going that extra mile in terms of our professional training. It means if we are going to go that extra mile, we need to break some of the advice or the rules of our recommendation or of our original training, which leaves us feeling quite exposed. And there's also the danger of making mistakes. So the talk's really about looking at both sides of the coin, the reason for having to go the extra mile, but also how can we, as workers, protect ourselves and our colleagues and our patients or customers in that process. And this is what we hope to cover today. The reason, one of the many reasons for going that extra mile is that because chaotic behaviour is often attributed is not attributed to vulnerability. It leads to judgmental thought processes kicking in, which leads to exclusion. So hostels, for example, which are meant to be places of safety, recuperation, are all subject inadvertently to these very basic psychological processes, which psychology calls attribution theory, that we all attribute reasons and causes, usually unconsciously, for people's behaviour. And when somebody's behaviour isn't clear or doesn't make sense, we tend to become quite judgmental. We tend to attribute a willful behaviour rather than attribute vulnerability. So there was a large study made on this, which really highlighted how the very organisations funded and set up to try and break the homeless cycle can in fact unconsciously contribute to the cycle.
Yeah, sorry, I just realised we were looking for, I've got a photo, that's actually me, that's a picture of me. And that's about 15 years old, roughly. And that's a police photograph as well. But anyway, the thing is, an example of that exclusion thing is that my probation officer, a lovely, lovely man, when I know him, shouldn't have been a probation officer, he was too nice. Sorry. No offence to probation officers, sorry. But he was a lovely, lovely guy. Heart of gold, that man. But he tried so hard to get me housed, constantly, do you know what I mean? I'd come out of prison, and then we'd have to go through all the rigmarole, and because of, when I was in these places, and like I say, I was drinking a lot, and self-medicating, if you like, and you know, inevitably I'd get violent, and not necessarily against people, but more against objects more than anything. I'd end up smashing my room up or something like that. And so eventually it got to the stage where nobody would provide me a service because they'd say, oh no, we're not having that Paul Ashton, no, you smashed the place up last time, blah, 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 and all this lot. So like I say, it's that cycle of exclusion. So, you know, I'm back on the street, I'm drinking again, inevitably, one of my things was to end up having a fight with police officers. I don't know why I did that, but, especially when I was drunk. If I saw a police officer and I saw a uniform, that was it. For some reason, I'm taking my anger out on you because you've got a uniform. And so I've got like 6 police assaults on my record or something like that. So of course then I'm back in prison for a while, and then I'm back out on the street, and it just constantly round. It became a running joke with my local prison, which was Strangeways at the time. The prison officers used to go, are you here again? Flipping it. You're here more times than I am, and I work here. So, I mean, it really was a running joke that, you know, they said they were going to put a revolving door on it for me, sort of thing, you know, keep a cell warm for me. So, yeah.
So, coming back to vulnerability, I found it really useful to be able to quote these kinds of figures to various people, that personality disorder or traumatized personality in fact accounts for a lot of very distressed and distressing behaviour. So for example, over 2/3 of prison population, what I found shocking at the time was 77% of suicides, successful suicides, I thought have been suffering from personality disorder. And this is the same with mental health populations. So this was quite a neat little way of drawing attention to policymakers, to gatekeepers, that, hey guys, you know, what's perceived as very chaotic, aggressive, incomprehensible, willful behaviour is in fact very distressed behaviour, is in fact a trauma reaction to something which we can't understand. We don't know what the trigger is, because the trigger can be internal, can be a memory, or it can be external, a tone of voice, a glance, which triggers off certain reactions. So I found this very useful as a way of getting across the underlying vulnerability. Part of that vulnerability is that somebody with this emotional distress, as opposed to, oh come on, pull your socks up, which most people more or less respond to, but people with this distress just can't pull their socks up, and in fact it keeps escalating. The distress just keeps escalating, which often ends up in themselves resorting to self-medication, self-harm as a way of calming themselves. As we saw, self-destruction, suicide, or emergency admissions. And this is what I found a lot of policymakers, gatekeepers and staff found quite difficult to understand, that they had a direct impact on somebody's level of distress. And we all assume, when we bring up children with colleagues, we all assume an ability to manage distress and for somebody to get it together. But in this case, most people just can't get it together. It's beyond their control. It is a trauma reaction, a very basic survival mechanism that kicks in, which is very distressing for themselves, but for everybody around, which is why it gives rise to a whole range of quite punitive reactions. Do you want to say anything about that, Paul?
Well, I mean, basically, it's like you said, that like you escalate. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and the distress gets more and more. And I mean, I'm feeling anxiety right now, sitting there and doing this. And that's surprising, really, considering I do this as a living now, sort of thing. But it's still there. I still get quite anxious. But my response is, what I tend to do now is I notice what my body's doing. I concentrate and focus on what my body's doing. So my body's getting anxious, my heart's getting faster, my head's trying to tell me all sorts of rubbish, but I'm ignoring that. And I'm saying, no, everything's fine, it's calm, it's okay, you're safe, it's okay. And so I listen to that side of myself more often now than that chaotic voice that's trying to say, like, oh, it's all, oh, panic, panic, thing, sort of thing. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks, that's a great illustration. So one of the recommendations of the report, which was fairly influential when it came out, was that by failing to respond in an enhanced manner, that a lot of homeless people, and 70% or so are thought, single homeless, are thought to have traumatized personalities. That the hostile system itself becomes part of the exclusion cycle, which is quite something to say, that the very industry or the very care system set up to help inadvertently becomes part of the exclusion process. I mean, that's something quite radical to get through to people and to have people engage with. And myself, when I look at my training, which was many decades ago now, I remember that there was an expectation that homeless people cannot be helped psychologically, that the circumstances are too unstable, that they are bound to be in a state of crisis. And of course, what psychological interventions can we bring to bear when someone's in a state of crisis, when they can't take anything in, when their cognitive facilities, memory, attention span, all of these things are in crisis mode, in survival mode. How can somebody get through to someone in that condition? So in those days, there was an assumption that for people to be able to gain from psychological intervention, their circumstances had to be settled. They had to be in a safe space, especially because psychology in those days involved a lot of challenging people regarding their defense systems in front of problems or distress. And defenses are developed in childhood and they're quite useful at that time, but as adults they then become ineffective or contributing to that person's problems. So the theory at the time was to change the defenses. But of course the defenses are there because they need to be there. It's like a castle being attacked. And it's the same with a person. So you can't go around trying to dismantle their defences while they're actually under assault, while they're in survival mode. Hence, the psychological establishment thought we can't help homeless people. And there was this expectation that people who could, the only people who could gain from psychological interventions were crisis and addiction free, because they could remember what was said from session to session, which the assumption, and this is a key point in my talk, the assumption was that someone who was actively addicted would not be able to remember what was being said from session to session. In my experience, that's not necessarily the case. But I found that memory seems to be quite dependent on the quality of engagement and on whether we've covered topics that are of interest and of relevance to the person rather than anything else. So as I already said, a stable situation, able to maintain a therapeutic relationship, regular attendance, all the things which, as we all know, homeless people or indeed excluded people in general just don't have the resources, material and psychological and emotional to do. So what do we do? So as I said, when I started, I started with some of these assumptions. Obviously, I was trained in that body of knowledge and practice. So when I started, I was rather taken aback that most people just missed their appointments or came maybe out one appointment out of 5, or incredibly suspicious of my intentions, very limited attention spans, not able to reflect or to think about the conditions, unable to access the feelings, have outbursts of fury. I've had many threats made to me. Having lots of different pressing needs, not necessarily just psychological. So in the face of this despair, I found that if I had any chance of convincing someone to come back, that I had to change my assumptions, that I had to change my practice. I couldn't expect them to change. The only thing or person that could change was me. So I naturally found that in order to have somebody stay in the room, that my style would become much more validating of that person, would be much more empathising. I'd be very transparent about what I was thinking and the reasons for my thinking. So I was absolutely straight with people, which I was trained not to be. So I would explain things a lot more. I'd need to suspend my judgment, this moral kind of attribution which we're all prone to do in the face of incomprehensible behaviour or emotions. I really have to keep my mind open. Also, I'm sure we've all experienced this. We've all come across absolutely incredible stories. Stories of people's lives that we wouldn't be able to imagine in our worst dreams, in our worst nightmares. And yet people are telling us these stories. What do we do with stories? Can we believe these stories? Are they making them up? What do we do? So I had to learn to say to myself, well, you just don't know, so just stick with it. Give this person a chance, see what happens. I found myself cast in the role of being an interpreter, that I'd get a pretty good understanding of where the person was coming from, of how they were perceiving the world, of what had happened to them. But I knew that they would be incapable of communicating that to other services or to other workers, because I put in a lot of time. Other services didn't have that time, or maybe didn't have the training or the attitude. So I found that I would be liaising with a lot of other workers to make the case for the person I've been listening to. I was taught to impose boundaries. That boundaries were thought, well, they are in some cases very important. But I learned very quickly that if a person was to trust me, find me useful, and want to come back to me, that I had to learn to negotiate the boundaries with them. That I couldn't just expect them to turn up to my appointment time. That I would have to explain why that was necessary. I would have to ask them, are there any obstacles to that? Do you think you can do that? And if they'd say no, to explore that, why can't you? And then we'd find a consensual solution to that. So there was that extra element of flexibility which I had to introduce as a practitioner, which very much went against my basic therapeutic training, which was psychodynamic, which is very much about boundaries. And if the boundaries aren't kept or broken, they're immediately interpreted, i.e. the person's pathologized. So I had to abandon all of that in order to keep the person coming back. So this has implications, of course.
Did you want me to mention something about the anger group?
Completely, yeah.
Just in terms of, like, we established, well, you say you established the drop-ins. Is this the anger group bit? I can't remember, sorry. Is it? Or is it the next slide? Right.
Well, yes, in terms of flexibility, absolutely.
Yeah. So me and John was approached by Westminster Council. They wanted, because of the level of aggression in the hostels and people being barred because of that aggression, that they wanted some way of addressing those issues. So he was approached about setting up an anger management group. But John felt that again, because like you said, the constraints of that and what have you, especially the chaotic nature of homeless people and what have you. So he approached me and told me what they suggested, and basically together we came up with this thing called the Anger Group, which has been established now for 4 years. It's in St Martin's in the Field, and basically it's a drop-in thing, and I based it loosely, very loosely, on an AA sort of style thing where people could come in, they could share if they wanted to, they didn't have to share, and it would be a supportive sort of group, and where they could share their experiences around anger, and maybe somebody could say, yeah, I used to be like that, but I did da-da-da, and so they could show examples of how they might deal with it better, sort of thing, and it's grown from strength to strength. I'm no longer sadly involved with it, but because of my work, but...
The group's been able to engage people who were thought to be unengageable because of the non-judgmental nature of the group. The group tolerated people coming in drunk, because it would be for street sleepers as well as hostel residents. So people would come in fairly drunk, but as long as they weren't disruptive, that they were accepted. So it's a great atmosphere of acceptance. And as Paul says, people would be on different stages of the journey of recovery, and people would share with other people at not the same stage. So there'd be it was a very communal experience, almost like a self-help group, which has had very powerful effects. But the need to provide an enhanced response, and I've talked with medical colleagues and nurse colleagues, and everybody says the same. It's not just psychologists or counsellors, that there is this need to go beyond the norm. What I and the counsellors found was it had implications, because we were trained to practice in a certain way, and we felt obliged to go beyond that. So we felt exposed. We felt that we could be exposed to fellow professionals' judgment. What the hell are you doing, guys? Or we could be exposed to making mistakes and to inadvertently cross lines which really shouldn't be crossed. So this is what we came to call as the professional superego. That we always felt there was this kind of second head on our shoulder, kind of saying, "You sure you're doing the right thing here?" You know, it's almost as if there was an embodied risk assessor kind of on our shoulder, kind of, and we felt that we had to placate this kind of risk assessor, and a very useful distinction we came across was the distinction between boundary crossing, which is very much the enhanced response, that you're going that extra mile, but not going so far that you're violating a boundary. And the difference between them is that the boundary crossing is temporary. It's kind of a one-off thing. Maybe somebody's in a crisis, a desperate crisis, so instead of seeing them once a week, maybe you'll see them 2 or 3 times a week, maybe for a month, just to make sure they got through that crisis and they came out of it okay. So it's that kind of example, that's boundary crossing, and you know why you're doing it, you know what your objective is. Whereas for boundary violation, that's where it's a deviation from the norm, which boundary crossing is as well, but it's a different kind of deviation. It's a deviation where one feels unable to discuss it with colleagues, that somehow it cannot be made public, it can't be discussed, So there's something else going on there. It might be something unconscious, it might be, who knows, but that's where the risk is. That's why it can be much more harmful. That this other agenda, maybe a personal agenda, an unconscious personal agenda, or whatever, that's kicking in. And that's why, as counsellors, therapists, psychologists, we all have to be so careful. We are constantly and that's where the self-reflective groups and practice come in, to reflect on our own behaviour. Why are we doing this? Why are we going the extra mile? Are we sure we're not getting something out of this for ourselves? Is there something exploitative in this? So a very important distinction to bear in mind. Bearing in mind, of course, that nothing breeds anger quicker than anger. So when a service user displays anger, our instant reaction usually is to be angry back. But that's our own personal human reaction. And obviously, as a counsellor, being angry back won't help that person. And that's where the training kicks in, for us to control our anger, be aware of it, note it, but keep on focusing on the person in an empathic, understanding manner. And that's the same with all workers, key workers, receptionists. When somebody is distressed and expresses intense distress or anger, that person will have a personal human reaction, one of anger back or whatever. And that's where the self-reflective practice kicks in, becomes quite important for people to learn gradually to read their reactions, understand how their reactions make the service user's reaction worse. So you need a forum where you can practice recognizing your reactions and also managing them in a professional manner. Now, there's been a lot of work around these principles of having to go the extra mile, but also doing it in a careful way so that you're not making things worse for the service user or yourself. And an American writer, Jay Levi, has developed a pre-treatment model, which I think he's put a language to, I'm sure, a lot of the experiences we have day in, day out, but he's put a language to it which is really useful. I mean, the general approach obviously enhances safety, but it promotes transition to stability or to an environment of safety. It's patient-centred, supportive, but it's also aimed at, in a very gentle way, to try and get the person to begin to think about possible goals or motivation, but in a very gentle way, in a very humane way. That's a general approach. And there's 5 principles in all. These are the first 3. Obviously the first one, promote safety. And this is where crisis intervention, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, becomes really useful as an opportunity to engage that person, to do something useful, to do something which the person finds useful and then wants to engage more, and also trust is established. Obviously develop the relationship. Again, thinking about a journey, because what I've come across is that many people feel stuck in the present. They're surviving the present. It's all about survival. And in that state of mind, any horizon, any time horizon, either past or future, doesn't exist. And I found a metaphor of a journey really, really useful in helping people come to think about, maybe I am not stuck, maybe I can get away from this state of stuckness. A common language construction, I think this is really fundamental, understanding what the person means and translating for them what we mean. So it's very microscopic. It's all about words, body language. It's at a very micro level, but it's a level we can control. We've got very little control over the environment, but what we can control is our interaction with someone. And hopefully it's also cost effective and doesn't necessitate extra costs. And this is where I found myself becoming involved in a fairly natural way. That I became a facilitator. I became a liaison between my patients and other services, because I knew their language. I could translate, and they trusted me. And I was able to use the language of the services I was talking with. So there was some kind of mutual understanding that was possible. But it had taken maybe 8 to 10 weeks of me engaging a person to be able to reach that stage. And this is another thing, this is a long-term game. That change, significant change, is really long-term. In the anger group, Paul and I came across people who said to us, it's only after 3 years of attending the group that I'm able now to talk about my story. That it's taken me this time. And of course, I don't know if you know, but trauma, what trauma does is it cuts the narrative. So people can't talk about what's happened. There are holes in the narrative, which is why they can come across as quite chaotic and inchoate and can't articulate what's happened. That's one of the effects of trauma. And it takes a long, long time for that to heal and for the person to begin to find the words to put to extraordinary experiences. Experiences which are usually outside of the realm of everyday language. So we were getting people saying some of these things to us in the anger group. So it takes a long time, which is an important message. It's an important case to be able to make to commissioners. Most services, as a lot of us know, are commissioned on a yearly basis, whereas I suggest that for any significant change to happen, we're talking about 2 or 3 years. And most personality disorder services offer exactly that. They offer 18 months to 3 years intensive psychotherapy. And I think, again, it helps us with the vulnerability argument, that if we compare what specialist services do for personality disorder, 18 months to 3 years of one-to-one counselling, of group work, 3 to 4 times a week. When you compare that with the level of service provided for homeless people and the period of time and engagement that's provided for homeless people, it pales into insignificance. And yet, 70% of single homeless people have traumatised personalities. So there's a real policy gap there. So facilitate, support change, and then of course there's a consideration of that person's material circumstances, which we all do in a way or other. So to conclude, we all know we need to respond in a special manner. I've thought of 4 levels of response, and we need to respond obviously in a careful manner. There's the individual practitioner level, in my case an enhanced clinical practice, but I'm also aware of the enhanced risks to myself and to my patients. So I have to have in place enhanced support systems. So I have weekly clinical supervision, for example, which isn't usual. Obviously, reflective practice sessions, and talking with colleagues, sharing dilemmas, sharing decisions, making it public. A young woman patient of mine was in a terrible crisis. I thought she was in danger. I actually visited her at the hostel, but before I did that, I told colleagues, and I put it in my notes, and I explained the rationale for my visiting her at the hostel. Because I knew that otherwise it could be seen as inappropriate behaviour, that I could be taking advantage of a vulnerable female patient. So it's those kinds, and obviously she got through the crisis and she's okay. But precautions are needed. At a service level, there's a great initiative that's beginning to take off called PIES. I'm sure some of you must have heard about it, psychologically informed environments. I think that's fantastic at an organisational level. I think it's really important that the senior management team buy into it, because they're the opinion makers, they're the cultural leaders, and we don't want policies to clash with the psychological attitude that's being asked of the organisation or the staff. At an institutional level, obviously there's the faculty guidelines. I think it's fantastic that Chris was talking this morning about curriculum development, these kinds of events. I think there's a real need to educate and to promote. So I think that's fantastic. And I think at a government level, there's already the CUF framework, which is a framework that was established in 2007, funded by the Ministry of Justice and Department of Health. Its remit was to train the labour force nationally to understand much more about personality disorder and be able to manage it much more constructively. I think if you want...
Sorry, I'll just quickly echo what you're saying as well, is that I work for Emergence, or freelance, but they provide me a lot of work. And Emergence are a service user led organisation, and they are basically they run the Pan London sort of cohort of the CUF training, and they projected in 5 years that it would train up to 10,000 staff. Up to date, they've trained 50,000. So it's it's a big thing at the moment. So.
And also I hear rumours that they're looking at a special programme for GPs.
Yeah, they are. They're in the process of producing that at the moment.
And also a special programme for homelessness, I believe.
Yep.
It's a mental health institute at Nottingham University which houses the programme. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Really insightful look at the triggers and the psychological basis for homelessness. I think those of us that work, I know probably all of us can really pick up on the points, and Paul, your experiences I think really mirror what we see in our patients. I mean for me the takeaway will be that chaos and the survival state, which I think is a really insightful description of what patients are going through. So a few questions.
What did CUF stand for again?
It's Knowledge and Understanding Framework.
For personality disorder.
Yeah.
Add for personality disorder when you Google it.
Yeah.
Can I ask one question? And if it's too personal, but do you know what changed it? What was the tipping point for you that
that's the question that always gets asked. No, because the thing is that I always say this. Obviously, like all human beings, we're extremely complex, and so there's no one easy answer. There's no one easy step that I can say. That was it. Definitively, that's what changed it. It was a series of different things that came along, and sort of thing. So things came together at the right moment, and it also goes back to the big basic one of all, I guess, is that you've got to want it. Do you know what I mean? You've got to want to change, and you've got to want to move on and so forth, sort of thing. Because it's that old adage: you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Sadly. So yeah, I guess it was a combination of lots of things that came in, and I was actually at the point in my life where, to be quite honest, I couldn't live like that anymore. I couldn't live in a homeless state anymore, and I didn't want to live that way, and I couldn't see any other way out. So I did try to commit suicide, but obviously, luckily, I didn't succeed. But you know, that's how desperate it got, to that point where I just couldn't live like that anymore. I hated living like that. I hated myself. I hated the whole thing, and I just didn't know how to change. And luckily, like I say, circumstances dictated that I inevitably ended up getting sectioned, and that's where basically my journey of recovery more or less kind of started.
That was fascinating. I mean, I suppose I have a suggestion around level 2 as well, because there's also the potential around, like, you know, the commissioning.
Thank you.
Psychologically informed commissioning.
Which is
because you talked about the gap between policy and this kind of working, but I suppose that needs to be kind of resolved at the commissioning level and moving. I think you go through kind of, as you get into an issue like this, you go through kind of waves of understanding, really. Homeless people are people without a roof, and you move on to, it's about physical and mental health, and then this is kind of another level in a way of understanding the complexity of what actually is being dealt with here. And I think commissioners have to go on that journey as well as practitioners to kind of understand what they're looking to get out of the service, what needs to be done. And then just a minor link to that. So then commissioners want results. So, and you talked about 3-year cycle.
Yes.
So what are the kind of outcome measures that services should be looking at if they're working in these kind of ways?
Can I deflect that to Paul? Because I'm a great believer in people knowing what they can achieve and what's achievable for themselves. And maybe related to the first question, Paul, maybe looking back on your journey, maybe it is possible or not to identify areas of improvement maybe that you experienced, or it might not be possible, maybe it's too far away now.
I don't know specifically. I mean, thing is, again, I'm not an expert in terms of how policies and this and that and all that carry on. But from my heart, the thing is that I would say that, like, it's funny because, like, I was with a commissioner a few days ago, and I've got a YouTube channel that I've set up called RENgage. That's all about you guys and service users, and I want people to come on board and bring suggestions and do that. Anyways, I've interviewed John. I'm hoping to interview Nigel at some point. And this lady, who's a Westminster Council commissioner, one of the things she said to me during that interview was that she was just so overwhelmed when she first met me because she never gets to see the other side. Do you know what I mean? She'll see people and they'll disappear and she'll think, oh, what's happened to them? Are they dead? Are they locked up in prison? They never get to see the end product, sort of thing. You know, the what's it? And that was, for me, that was really encouraging because I'm thinking, like, wow, you know, here's a person who's seen the possibilities. So she's now convinced that maybe what John's doing and people like yourselves are doing is important and valuable enough to invest that time and money into, sort of thing, because the end results are worth it at the end, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know if that's really kind of answered the question or not, to be quite honest.
Yeah, in a way, but if I can add to it,
Yeah.
but I think they're not. I think they're the same targets that are being asked now. You know, in terms of better health, better engagement, more ability to sustain stability. But it takes longer to achieve that. I think because of vulnerability, the depth of vulnerability isn't recognised. It's not recognised that in order to achieve those things, for many people, it will take longer. And it will require an enhanced service. So when I look back on journeys of people I've come across, the fact that they keep coming back to me, that's a major success compared to how they started. They'd only come after a suicide attempt, and then nobody would see them again until the next suicide attempt. So when they came to me, I was able to convince them to come back in between suicide attempts. So then the suicide attempts lessen. Then because they're able to sustain a relationship of trust with me, they're then able to sustain relationships of trust with other workers and other services. If they become upset with those interactions, they can always come back to me, phone me, I can reassure them, I can support them, re-engage, the liaison bit, the common language bit, and they re-engage and they resume the trajectory. Because as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of homeless people don't have families to fall back on, or they're estranged from their families. And us as adults, when we have moments of crisis, we fall back on our families or on our friends. But who do homeless people fall back on in terms of crisis? So there's something about having a secure, trusted base which one can turn to in times of need. And that's what my service is trying to establish itself as, that we're trying to see people through quite a prolonged journey of recovery. Even when we stopped treating them, we say to them, look, keep in contact with us. If things go wrong further down the road, come back to us, let us know.
That was one of the biggest things for me in terms of like how things were different in the treatment I got from the Tony Hillis unit at Lambeth Hospital. Was well after I got discharged from that hospital, it was made very clear from the start that if I ever needed to go back just for a chat or whatever, even though no longer officially a patient sort of thing, that was more than welcome to, sit down with somebody and have a little chat. And it was that sense that there was a safety net, that somewhere I could fall back to if things just really got too much and I was like, oh my God, I can't cope with this. I mean, I was a late 30s, early 40-year-old man going into a flat, never had a flat in my entire life before, didn't know how to pay a bill, didn't know how to set up, anything essentially, do you know what I mean? And so little simple things that most people would take for granted, I didn't even know how to do. And so luckily I had a support network around me that helped me to get through that. But like I say, things just got too much, and they did at times, they really did. But I could always go back to the hospital and say, oh, my day's been like this, and it's like having that family, like you say, the family that I never had, do you know what I mean, that they were there for me, sort of thing, so that was really important.
And Nigel, I think we've got time for one more question.
Just a couple of comments really, just to say thank you very much to you both. I always enjoy hearing you speak. These guys are my absolute heroes in the mental health world. And you're kind of constantly challenging my preconceptions. So, I mean, in the end, it was mainstream mental health services who sorted it out. You were sectioned, and you got an excellent response,
yeah.
And they were flexible. So that's mainstream mental health services that gets such a bad press the whole time. They actually they just did it really, really well.
But there was specialist personality.
Yeah, it was a specialist personality.
Rare resource, and that's the other thing, is that in all my years as a homeless GP, I never managed to get any of my patients into PD services, which is a fabulous thing that you're doing.
Yeah. What was your route into it?
Basically, I was living in Westminster, homeless, like I say, and it was just absolute chaos. Do you know what I mean? I was stealing, because I was one of my things, ridiculously, I think it's ridiculous, was sniffing glue. I did it for years and years and years and years. Something that most people grow out of, but I did it for years. And I stole this tin of glue, and it was just chaos, and it was constantly happening. And the police were constantly, coming out to me and all this lot. And there was one police officer who was like, do you know what, this can't go on. Because either you're going to seriously harm yourself, or you're going to seriously harm somebody else. And none of the services wanted anything to do with me. You know what I mean? He tried to get me into St Thomas's, they wouldn't want nothing to do with me, sort of thing. So there's nothing wrong with him, he's just a bad person, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So, anyway, the thing is, I don't know exactly what happened at this point, but one time, not long after that, I smashed the shop window of a place where I used to give me free toast, these guys. I didn't realise at the time, it was their shop. And I smashed the shop window, and the police came, and I was standing there, I must have had guilty written across my forehead, because when I realised it was these guys, I felt so bad. Do you know what I mean? Because these guys have been so kind to me. And so I'm standing there, and he goes, it was you, wasn't it? And I went, I was like a little naughty boy. Honestly, I was like, I'm really sorry. And so anyway, they took me to prison again. I was on the Isle of Sheppey, and whilst I was there, I had a breakdown in there. And whilst I was there, people from the Tony Hillis unit, because it was a brand new, it was one of the pilot schemes in England, and they turned around and said, look, we've got a bed for you, you'll be there for 6 months, and then we've got a hostel at the end of it. Well, to be quite honest, the only thing I heard was hostel, and I heard away off the street. So that's why I signed up. So, I just wanted to get off the street. I'd had enough of living like that. And like I say, I was prepared to actually kill myself because I couldn't live like that any longer. I seriously couldn't. So, but anyway, like I say, went to the Tony Hillis unit, and luckily that was the start of my journey. So.
Well, it shouldn't happen at St Thomas's anymore.
Just one thing, we interrupted John just before the end of the last slide. If you want to learn more about personality disorder, that paper, Meeting the Challenge, Making a Difference, which is the right hand.
Oh yes, I've got copies of this at home. If people want
you can just Google that. If you Google Meeting the Challenge, Making a Difference, you can download the PDF, and it made the most sense to me about.
Yes, it's brilliant, isn't it?
It's really good paper. It's very accessible, and I learned a lot from it.
Thank you.